So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hearing tonight's conversation about the first English translation of Guy Hocquenghem's Gay Liberation after May 68. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country, and if you haven't checked us out, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. Unfortunately, with the ongoing pandemic, we continue to be on hiatus from in-person gatherings and have transitioned our community and author events entirely to an online virtual space. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. Notably, next week on Tuesday, May 17th, we're hosting investigative journalist Robert Evans and author Margaret Killjoy for a virtual event to celebrate the release of Evans' first novel, After the Revolution. So if you're interested in signing up for that or any other event happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I will also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. A note for those attending in the live audience, there will be time at the end of today's conversation for Q&A. But if you're interested in asking a question at any point, I'll encourage you to submit them throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom, or in the comments if you are following along on the Facebook live stream. Cool, moving on to tonight's event and speakers. To mark the publication in English of Gay Liberation after May 68, tonight will feature a panel discussion convened and moderated by translator Scott Branson and featuring Kadji Amin and Max Fox. Panelists will read passages from the collection and discuss both the history and the possible futures of gay liberation. For folks not familiar, Guy Hocquenhem was one of the early radical theorists of homosexuality, as well as a militant who participated in the May 68 uprising in Paris. Most of his writing has not been translated into English, though his ideas have still been highly influential on both queer theory and radical queer street action. Kadji Amin is Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory University and is currently at work on a second book on backwards trans theory. Max Fox is a writer, editor, and translator based in Philadelphia. His writing has appeared in Book Forum, The New Republic, The Baffler, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among many others. And he is currently on the editorial collective of Pinko magazine. Scott Branson is a queer trans writer, translator, teacher, and anarchist living in Western North Carolina, and currently lecturer in gender, women's, and sexuality studies at Appalachian State University. Their edited volume, Surviving the Future, Abolitionist Queer Strategies, will be published by PM Press in October 2022, and their book, Practical Anarchism, A Daily Guide, will be published by Pluto Press in November of this year. So Scott, Kadji, Max, thank you so much for being here tonight, and I will go ahead and pass it over to Scott.
Thanks, Ash, for the welcome and the introduction and for having us. And I'm so excited to talk with Max and Kadji. Also, just note, Max also has translated Hocquenghem, translated the posthumously published final text, The Amphitheater of the Dead. Do you want to say anything about that before, just since you, any other information about that?
It may come up in discussion. I'm not sure how relevant it is right now, but
okay.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, we got two translators of Hocquenghem, and then Kadji Amin's Disturbing Attachments also really like it touches on a lot of the moment that Hocquenghem is writing in this book. So I think we'll have a really great discussion. We decided that we'd start out with a reading. I'm going to read the last text of the book. So this book is a collection of pieces that he wrote from 68 to 74, I believe. Mostly for like militant journals. Some of them are kind of like communiques or pamphlets that were passed around. And it really tracks his like the movement of his thought from May 68 through his participation in the Front Homosexual d'Action Révolutionnaire, or FAR, and then his like his kind of split with that movement. And this last piece, A Shameless Transversalism, is him kind of looking at what he felt went wrong with that moment of gay liberation. And where he kind of wants it to go. So I'll read that, and then we'll have discussion. And as Ash said, feel free to just put in questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll like fold them into our discussion. A shameless transversalism. Let's invent slits and slopes that slice hierarchies and the specializations according to new layers. We cut up social reality how it suits us, risking confusion. We systematically pass from one order to another: aesthetics, politics, turn-ons, theory. We transversalize by transposing what happens here somewhere else without rhyme nor reason, not in order to make everything the same, for we need potential differences to power our cut. We don't seek to create hybrids, to marry everything through limp mediations, but to make everything intersect, to interpolate, as they say, fags with motorcycles, foyer with drugs, leftism with cash. Money, it's sort of the bourgeois transversalism, this universalization that is the simplest way to pull everything down to the same scale. Our movement responds to this. Instead of putting everything in the same key, leveling it all out to make anything exchangeable, we transmute from one order to another practically. It's not a matter of saying love, family, profession, science, war, everything is revalued or devalued according to a single scale. We can't expect anything from a universal exchange, even though its reign has made everything possible for us. But we have everything to desire from the unmediated transmutation of one nature into another. Not what's exchangeable, but transformable or replaceable bit by bit. Transgender, for example, is not the middle between man and woman, or the universal mediator, man into woman, woman into man. It's one part of a world transferred into another, like we pass from one universe to another universe, parallel to the first, or perpendicular, or askew. Or rather, it's a million inappropriate gestures, transferred features, events, growing breasts, removing hair, happening in as untimely a way as the appearing or disappearing of a feline smile in Alice in Wonderland. We aren't looking for new material. We produce the unexpected. The new only ever appears wherever the old assigns it its place. Producing the unexpected, the improper, a flying carpet that rescues us from taking root in shame and propriety. This transversalization provides a response to the mobile warfare of capital, its fluid and instantaneous displacement from one continent to another by the forces of multinationals, a response to its slipperiness. In the battle led by capital, territorial defenses, the political and moral defense against capitalist cynicism, the theoretical defense, truth against formalism, the syndicalist defense, labor force against the shape-shifting vampire, the sentimental defense against dehumanization by machines, are just like the Maginot Line facing German tanks. Humanist progressivism is still fighting the last war. It blames capital for being stateless, without family, without morals, whereas all this baggage disables us, delivers us unarmed and tied up to the shape-shifting circulation of money. Transversalism, transgender, versatility, slide from one order to another, following the rifts. Social surfaces smoothed over by the waves of repetitions without jouissance no longer show us anything but the usual scenery to look at, a flat horizon of dull convictions without adventure. But if a crack appears, a split, let's go to a new layer, cut into the raw tissue, and suddenly a freely flowing vein will open, new smells bubbling up with unimagined desires. But theory will never break or crack its own glass, not any more than the flow of cash will cut through the ocean of the monetary system. Throwing a tomato works against someone making a speech, as we discovered in May, but so does a very specific kind of touch against political attacks. Enough with the well-behaved scientific and interdisciplinary transversalities, with institutional analysis used to confirm all the fears or to spice up restructuring and reforms. Journey through the institutions. Duchka already spoke about it. Does this just mean adding a new kind of tourism beyond nations and countries and the air-conditioned buses of new institutional internship assignments, training, professional audits, where the windshield of analysis protects the researcher? Not here. A shameless, slutty transversalism, having lost all modesty, all sense of what's appropriate, that endlessly tries to put square pegs in round holes, losing its identity while gaining it, lewd when accepted as theoretical, untimely. Fleeting, spinning in a spiral, like a journey through time, fully present at every instant, but cutting another path at the same time, confusing the order of causes and consequences before it tangles these big strings through determining first after and then before, carving up the worm of order. The homosexual movement is frozen. And where's your landmark movement in all of this? A phare ball and chain attached to the token homosexual's foot, a heavy collar whose bells alert the entire order of your movements at every moment. You must choose, remain motionless or signal where you are, where you're coming from, where you're going. Militant homosexual revolutionary here, ding dong ding. Yet I had believed that at this level, it was so specific, so local compared to the old organized politics, we would never be pinned down by social entomology. The homosexual movements are done. Certainly they'll still develop, bring about changes and conditions for fags, but as movements, they're dead. The internal spring that makes them work is at the end of its lifespan. They've used up all the energy that could arise from the framework they were given. Some indications: the issue of the magazine Recherche, published before the summer of '73 by a group that would no longer agree to be seen as part of the phare, as well as some women not of the MLF persuasion under the title About the Shattered Phare and MLF. Even the Nouvel Observateur mentioned that this issue broke with a phare whose whereabouts no one knew any longer. In the USA, gay lib no longer exists as a centralized movement. It's split into groups that either don't give a shit about homosexual liberation in general, trans people, sadomasochists, or who violently attack the very idea of a homosexual movement. One example is the Révolutionnaire effeminists, newly born from the rubble of gay lib since June '72. This is how they begin their manifesto, which caused quite a stir. We, the effeminists, invite all like-minded men to join with us in making our Declaration of Independence from gay liberation and all the other male ideologies. In any case, today the phare has fortunately split into more specific concerns than at its beginning. An American friend attending for the first time what we still call a General Assembly of the phare, a gigantic cruising site on 6 floors of a university building, probably the most considerable cruising space in Paris, if not in Europe, asked, "What is it supposed to be?" He was hoping to launch a discussion that our answer, it's the General Assembly, would have brought into militant terms. But this place is not supposed to be anything. It rejoins itself and rejoices in itself each week. Thus, the phare has really transformed Paris's homosexual geography. And that's already not so bad, having removed the police threat for the time being. Meanwhile, all kinds of indications allow us to imagine that a scope of homosexual movement, however narrow and fragile it might be, has recently emerged from the phare. It's as true for the news media as for public gardens. I've been surprised at nights in the Tuileries where fags armed with clubs handle hooligans or even the cops. We can see it. Thirsting for other modes of organizing than the phare doesn't mean giving up on all homosexual militancy. In 1973, the pervasiveness of militant homosexual movements linked to leftism in Europe, Holland, Denmark, West Germany, Italy, shows that a traditional political space is being taken over. But how sad is political space? A demo of fags down the Kurfürstendamm in West Berlin chanting against sexual racism like it's properly new and not at all untimely. Fake unities. The very term homosexual gets in the way with what it implies of guaranteed homogeneity. It's too transparent. Our movements are much more hetero than homo. We don't aim to be faithful to ourselves in permanent self-sameness. There was a rule in the FAR and MLF that said only women had the right to speak about women and only fags had the right to speak about fags. This rule assigns one speech to one subject, forces acceptance of an identification, claims territories, a rule that had meaning when it aimed to block speech meant to oppress women and homosexuals by identifying them as such, all while keeping the benefits of the status of manly man for the speaker. A rule that becomes oppressive once it obliges me to restrict myself to the role of official fag, that is, of speaking about fags as a fag, from a fixed and assigned place. Once it obliges a comrade from the MLF to take on the nature of woman, that narrows the scope of their desires and forbids them or me from becoming, for example, a fag lesbian. This rule died for me once it transformed itself into passport control for speech. Of course, we must say where we speak from, but we should be able to move. Thus, it seemed to me that after 3.5 years in the USA and 2 years in France, the homosexual and women's movements turned out to be false alliances, or they became false. Yes, these movements broke off from oppressive holes, political groups, ideologies, and to a limited extent, social classes. But in order to establish others, big protest rallies, anti-sexist, anti-male movements. But we don't live off anti-sexism. In order to set the guest molecules, the little gears of jouissance into motion, we have to melt the ice of these big groups that restrain them, sever and break up these grand alliances where archetypes return at full speed. What Marcuse wrote on this matter in his last book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, reflects rather well a certain inclination of the women's liberation movement, especially the effeminists. Quote, that this image and reality of the woman has been determined by an aggressive male-dominated society does not mean that this determination must be rejected, that the liberation of women must overcome the female nature. For the revolutionary and feminists, joining the women's side involves developing feminine qualities in themselves, love of the other and not the rough sexuality of gay live, sensitivity, etc. A whole moral rearmament program against male capitalists and humanity. Just as a certain MLF ideology forces women to, quote, take on her femininity so as not to betray it. The archetype of the liberated fag has fortunately never had enough power to impede the fragmentation of the homosexual movement, a fragmentation that the MLF resists better. But don't you feel here too the unease that cracks the clear consciences of the MLF, owing certain accepted forms of unity to the cost of a real psychological lockdown, to the blackmail of faithfulness or betrayal? The fact that a woman can gather around her a whole group of girls who become her patients, bathing in a mixture of political leadership and effective psychoanalytic submission, is not surprising once you felt the power of the MLF ideological glue. The bonds of the FAR were more practical, cruising, than ideological. Their breakup is just as easy. The MLF isn't collapsing, but its ideology safeguards its cohesiveness in an oppressive way. Principle, women against splintered homosexuals. Two sides in this new constellation that arises from the splintering of the homosexual movements. One side is splintered practices, forming little groups around sex and life, such as trans groups, pedophiles, or Arabophiles, who are described in an issue of Recherche, 3 billion perverts, or the American sadomasochists. And the other side, demonstrated by American revolutionary feminism, is the guilty conscience of being male and not female. One side acts in the body and blurs sexual definitions. The other side unifies everyone around intangible and simple sexual identities. We are men and therefore oppressors. How can you forgive our nature? The appearance in the issue of Recherche of innumerable erect cocks allowed a certain MLF ideology to classify immediately. These are men, misogynists. Similarly, the American feminists haphazardly condemn masculine sadism, maso-transgender, rock transgender, and Warholism as continuations of male ideology. In other terms, the movement is stretched between two extremes, one body with multiple organs, sado, maso, trans, etc., and a new morality that aims to exclude the diversity and the polymorphism of the new perverts to the benefit of one and only one law, which draws a line between friends and enemies of the people, of women. The revolutionary feminists write in the Feminist Manifesto, 1, sexism, all women are oppressed by all men, including ourselves. This systematic oppression is called sexism. 2, sexism itself is the product of male supremacy, which produces all other forms of oppression, racism, classism, ecological imbalance. 3, gynarchism. Only that revolution which strikes at the root of all oppression can end any and all of its forms. That is why we are gynarchists. That is, we are among those who believe that women will seize power from the patriarchy. We recognize the style, this sort of Mao feminism, uses the whole operation of typical political discourse, just changing proletariat to women. This type of masochist delusion, for these guys don't doubt for a minute their untouchable male nature. They even glory in confessing it. Does it threaten us as well? By wanting to discover the sexist enemy everywhere, we mistake the meanings of signs. The Caucus in research, for example, they're only hijacked signs that no longer occupy their transcendent signification, the grand phallus that distinguishes man from women. These Caucus are as fragmented as dildos or graffiti. Meanwhile, a new phallus appears in the full sense in this law that discriminates and excludes in the name of the woman principle. Likewise, for sadomasochistic practices, they're condemned by the ideology of a certain MLF or by the feminists who read the signs of oppression, hijacked by the pervert towards the aims of jouissance as the reality of oppression. But where does moral masochism stand? The kind based in submission, if not on the side of an ideology that replaces the worker with a woman in the role of the great guilt tripper? Certain MLF groups are the worst enemies of trans people. The effeminists, who call it by the old psychiatric name of eonism, write, certainly sadomaso-eonism in all its forms is the very antithesis of feminism. Both the masochists and the eonists are particularly an insult to women since they overtly parody female oppression. Strangely enough, it's because the gay lib leaders had accepted trans people and sadomasochists into the ranks of the usual June parade that the feminists announced their refusal to participate in the march. This is the woman principle at work. Everything that blurs the clear definition of the new law, everything that escapes grand classification is the enemy. Everything that is a hijacked sign, a perverse use, is dangerous, as if feminine qualities were not basically trans to begin with. The great upending. Let's not fool ourselves. Gender is no more the grand signifier than anything else. And for that matter, sex can and should be challenged with violence, with art. The desiring fascism that marks the annals of the great libertines of the Western world is also the great big sense of being in one's place, dressed up to look like the most absolute radicalism and revolutionary apoliticism. Those who enjoy the most advanced perversions, lavish necrophiles of New York, or connoisseurs of Amsterdam's saunas and all of Europe's parks, terrify me in their perverse professionalism, having the power to rebuild everywhere with the help of credit cards and the grand hotels, their territory from which any event is excluded ahead of time. There is a multinational power of sex, as stateless as capital, but also as nonchalantly oppressive and sure of itself, whose dividends are measured in cockstrokes. Here too, we get caught willingly, as if the whole journey since May could be summarized in the move from the world of slaves to the world of libertinized masters. But breakthrough, we want to cut up the world of masters with the world of slaves, just like we want to cut up the world of slave territories painstakingly defended by narrow morals with the stateless jouissances of the world of masters. Sade and the French Revolution, these two ruptures and many others meet here. The great upending imagines stronger emotions, more intense joys, deeper fractures than the incomes of some perversions. Fags, motorcycles, leathers, drugs, whose capital is as off limit as a big bank's. Perversion first differentiates itself from normal pleasure in that it costs more, since for the social machine, it amounts to a waste of forces and a quick potlatch, carefully isolated from the production that works to accumulate these forces. This is its way of being integrated in society. But living out perversion in such a representation as a shareholder who spends their income instead of investing it somewhat narrows jouissance. In truth, perversion drags us along when its expenses are beyond the measure of the normal price range of our society. To say that the great upending corresponds with a luxury that is very expensive, according to Lyotard, is to play along with a social integration of jouissance as extra or a supplement to the menu. It means accepting the organization of the discourse shaped by the relation of oppressor-oppressed, the squabbling that gauges the jouissance of the masters by wasted fruits of labor, thereby giving it importance and prohibiting its use by the slaves. So what? What if the oppressed did find out that what the masters pay a high price for could just as well be free? All the money in the world used up in buying the tiniest orgasm in the Gare du Nord bathrooms, to close the gap by paying for perverse jouissance according to the law of value. Capital would be swallowed up in vain. The price of perversion is high enough, as gigolos know well, to break the financial balance of a world based exclusively on labor and capital, precisely because it doesn't follow the laws of capitalist profitability or the laws of the defense of the labor force. Let's upend ourselves and declare the law of value bankrupt. In other words, luxury could be free because it has no price. 3 billion perverts, 3 billion superstars. We always imagine that we need a fund of fans and normal people whose extorted surplus value bankrolls the star system or perversion. Wrong, it's a matter of position, a matter of breaking out, not of linking explanation-exploitation, but rather of cutting. Thus, an old story of commitment dies. We no longer commit ourselves to just battles. We act through our positions, not out of a sense of men's battles, but through the breaking out of tiny obsessions for no reason. Getting high, motorcycles, sodomy, being trans, all these ways of living aren't just an issue of how to be revolutionary, but are the absolute present of the untimely. We don't tackle the big questions that concern humanity head on. We slip sideways between two layers of guilty conscience, crumbling the frameworks where they try to confine us from behind into multiple quiverings of the social body and its infinite urgent places. So that's that text. I love that. I just love that essay. And I feel like it's like, it really speaks to our current moment in a lot of ways. But I'll stop talking and kind of move it over to Kadji and Max to kind of add some ideas. We were thinking about like the kind of general way of to get to what we want to talk about is what is Hocquenghem's critique of the liberation movement at this moment in this essay?
I think in this essay, and it pops up at several moments in this book overall, a lot of it has to do with it becoming an identity politics or a politics around identities, right? And he mentions in what you read, the way that starts creating new rules, that only fags can speak for fags, only women can speak for women, right? And in other parts, he also talks about how the creation of this discrete entity called the homosexual, or this discrete group of people, actually is very safe for society, right? And part of what he wants to do is create the breakdown of civilization itself, right? And so that's not a good thing for him. And so what he's interested in, rather than identity and rather than sexual or gender identities, is desire. You know, his other book is called Homosexual Desire, imagined according to a Deleuzian kind of constant connections of desiring machines, right? Each with the other. And that would be beyond all identities. And so I think that, you know, in that revolutionary moment of May 68, like, at least from his point of view, all of these new desires are being unleashed, right? Desires that don't quite fit the script of a kind of Marxist revolutionary narrative in which the proletariat is the beginning of the next phase, right? So desires outside of the script of Marxism, desires that bring the focus back to the body, to the sexual, right? And to all the ways that people can sexually connect with other people, right? And for a moment, gay liberation interests him in that he sees it as the site of the unleashing of all of these desires, right? But by this point, I think that he's become quite critical of how it has tended to devolve into debates around identities, this identity versus that identity, who can speak for whom, right? Is the point of gay liberation to create a homosexual constituency that speaks for itself and demands certain political rights, right? Or is it something else? And I think that what he sees, you know, one thing that I find interesting is the way he talks about the man, right? The man who is not homosexual, who is in a sense made safe by these loud, out and proud homosexuals, right? Who say, I'm gay, right? Mm-hmm. So the normal man gets to say, okay, well, you're gay. That's important. You can speak about that. You can say what you want, and you know, and I'm safe over here. I'm just straight, right? And so he's kind of pointing to, throughout this text, a whole bunch of much more messy encounters in which, you know, men are having sex with faggots, right? And men are desiring faggots, and faggots are bringing out the potential homosexual desires within all people, right? And he sees much more potential in that, in homosexual desire, rather than that, you know, that could circulate, you know, between all these bodies and could come from unlikely places, rather than in homosexual identity as a standing ground for politics.
Yeah, I mean, Kadji, that was a really helpful gloss on that. And thank you also for doing his other book intro, because I'm not as, I feel like I'm not as quick to summarize it. But I think what's interesting about this text, this book is really, I think one of the cool things about this book is that it's so, convoluted, I guess. I mean, is the right word, because he's really interested in this idea of evolution as opposed to revolution. So like you can kind of read this text as a bit of a self-critique, right? Where he's like, I once had these kind of like investments in the, you know, potentially like liberatory or kind of like shattering or whatever capacities of affirming this stuff, and now I'm like a bit less optimistic or whatever. You know, you like you said, like the kind of, because so famously Hocquenghem in France is one of the first sort of publicly self-identified homosexuals. He's one of the first people to have a like coming out front page article in the whatever newspaper it was in the 70s. And he discovers that this has this kind of like social useful kind of like sublimating function for everybody else. It positions him as the sort of the one responsible for kind of like bearing and acting and sort of like living out these desires that everybody has. It's a social thing, because this is the sort of, yeah, this is the Freudian part of his thing. It's like there's this kind of like fundamental you know, polymorphous, unshaped desire that has to be managed and channeled or whatever through socialization. And so like the gay movement somehow like ends up reaffirming this sort of imperative to like cordon off desire in these ways. And so in this text, he's like, they didn't do it. Like that didn't really achieve the kind of like freedom that I'm looking for. I think the line, I just, for whatever reason, this time you read it, Scott, the line where he's like, we want to cut up the world as slave territories, painstakingly defended by narrow morals and with the stateless jouissances of the world of masters. I never really grasped that before, but I mean, yeah, describing, I guess, like the identity position as a slave territory is like really striking, and I'm not totally sure like what to do with that, but it's whatever, it goes some way towards explaining like his sort of vehemence against this this thing that he once like really felt a lot of allegiance to. But yeah, there's some things that, I mean, in terms of his critique and how relevant it is, I mean, some of this stuff, the effeminists are kind of a funny like historical footnote, but some of the form of argumentation that they're using is like, it's familiar, right? It's like, this is some of the same sort of turf stuff that you see that is also you know, that has all these connections with sort of anti-sex work ideologies that like for whatever reason like seem to be a way of justifying like a really heavy commitment to the sort of spontaneity or the naturalness of gender, and like gender as hierarchy, like sort of femaleness as the suffering position often is like what you can read in a lot of the turf stuff. And like, so in this feminist thing, he's like, they kind of love the phallus, right? They love that they have to confess that it's so powerful. And in a similar way, you see this kind of inversion where turfs are somehow equating femaleness with misogyny, effectively, with suffering on a kind of like naturalized basis. So it's clear that the sort of tendencies that he is kind of positioning himself against in this movement have had a successful 50 years or whatever. At the very least, they haven't sort of like gone extinct. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to jump away too much, but yeah, it's interesting to think of him as a kind of like like not a time capsule, but he kind of like, he preserves something kind of like unique, I guess, about this moment when it's like this stuff, this politics hasn't totally committed itself fully to the question of rights or the question of identity, which I suppose it never really has, but like in terms of like, you know, the forms of argumentation that are available to us, the forms of political discourse that's acceptable to sort of advance in public. A lot of these things that he seems very like, you know, upset about are still recognizable. And it's, yeah, it's cool that he, well, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know, I don't want to be like, glad that he had to suffer this disappointment or whatever, so that we could now see that there was once a possibility to change, even though it didn't happen. But like, it's interesting to see him kind of, yeah, level these critiques in a way that's still so familiar, you know?
Yeah, and I think like the frustration is also super familiar, right? Like for anyone who tries to get involved in like radical stuff, like the frustration that I think is like the major affect of this essay is like always kind of present. I think like, you know, to kind of tie what both of you are saying together in ways like, you know, he seems to think that the gay movement basically used itself up in the simple act of like coming out, right? Like it basically just gets reduced to that. Like coming out is the epitome of it, which then makes that identity kind of position, as you were saying, Kadji, like that you get to sort of distract or like take away the possibility of gayness from the straight guys. But then, so that's like the disappointment of the movement is like he had some hopes for it, but it actually just is like totally exhausted in that thing. And then what he looks in this essay, he's like, actually, the only thing we really did was like create a good cruising space that was like free from the cops for a little while, which I think is, you know, I think that's funny and also telling. But then when in that part about where you were talking about the like defending the slave territories, that's where he's talking about like luxury and like libertines. And I see that also as a you know, a lot of this book is trying to think about recuperation and the way that like radical militant movements can like become mainstreamed or defanged through institutionalization or through like media and representation. And I see that too as something that's super present today, that a lot of like the things that had previously been associated with like deviant sexualities or deviant identities are like commodified, right? And that's sort of what he's talking about. And he's like, the joke's on them. Like you can pay this high price for like, you know, doing a kind of, you know, whatever libertine sexual tourism, but you can get that stuff for free, right? Like that, that's the joke. So I just find that part of it really interesting too, that he's like talking about how it becomes kind of like cool, right? Like the gay movement then becomes like a cool thing that then affects culture in a particular way. And it's another reason why he's disgusted with it. And later when he, in his like, you know, next phase of writings, he's like gives up the figure of, you know, the homosexual or even the fag and focuses on this idea of the faux, kind of a different sort of figure. And that was something that Kadji, you were talking about when we were like preparing our discussion. You were like talking about the losses of gay liberation, like what gets lost when the movement gets like announced in this way. And maybe I could like throw it to you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, you know, partly through my earlier book, which focused a lot on pederasty, but now in my work on backwards trans theory, just thinking, undoing the history of sexuality as progress narrative model, and trying to think about, you know, even moments where we can understand why activists made a certain choice, right? And where we can acknowledge certain benefits from that, seeing what was left behind in the process, right? And one thing I'm actually not sure about is whether gay liberation and gay rights can ever be separated, right? Because gay liberation, the gay liberation movement, both in France and in the United States, quickly within a few years became a gay rights movement that was premised on a certain type of politics of respectability, right? As soon as it becomes a politicized rights movement, It needs to say, well, here is the subject of gay rights, and this is a subject that can be folded into liberal institutions with ease, right? And so who falls out of that is the pederast and the pedophile, first of all, right? Because of their challenge to laws of consent and actually to the nuclear family, right? To parents' ownership over children. And so that's a really complicated debate that I was looking at in my first book. But strangely enough, from the point of view of the present, during the heyday of gay liberation in France, the pederast and in some cases the pedophile were seen as the exemplary figures for gay liberation, more so than the gay man, because of the very way that they threatened to undo the family, and because of the way that for gay liberationists, they promised the liberation of childhood sexuality, which in that Freudian model that you gestured towards, Max, is the beginning of the repression of all sexuality and the creation of a disciplined workforce. So they invested that idea of the liberation of child sexuality with this enormous revolutionary force, which may seem naive or even damaging to us today. But on the other hand, I think that in the present, the lines around sex between minors and adults have hardened to such an extent that it becomes impossible to talk about the sexual agency of even teenagers, say, right? Or of the long traditions within both gay and lesbian communities of, say, an older partner bringing out a younger partner, and teaching them the ways of gay life, teaching them how to have queer sex, which was understood to not be something that came naturally, unlike heterosexuality. Whether or not that comes naturally is another question. But this whole idea of a kind of pedagogy into gay culture, a pedagogy of sex, right, was part of that practice. So I don't know. I think that on the one hand, I find the debate around pederasty, pedophilia during that time completely insufficient, and on the other hand, I think that there's no room for debate in the present, right? So that's definitely something that has been lost. Now I've been thinking more about those kind of gender variant figures that were lost during that time, and so you mentioned in your editor's or your translator's introduction, Scott, that you decided to translate travesti as transgender, right? And that makes a lot of sense in terms of tying it to the present, and also in terms of the fact that people who were called travesti at that time were often, living full-time as women, right? They weren't just cross-dressing the way we think about cross-dressers today, but full. So the queens at that time, a lot of them were also living full-time as women, right? So that category of queen and travesti is largely overlapping, right? And they're a lot messier than those categories, than how we understand those categories today. And I wanted to point people who might be listening towards the introduction to a special issue of TSQ on the transsexual and the transvestite that recently came out, edited by Emmett Drager and Lucas Platero. And they talk about the transsexual and the transvestite as two figures who have been made backward by the progress narrative of trans history. And they argue that when it comes to the transvestite, one of the reasons that the transvestite has been made backward is because of the ways that the figure of the transvestite doesn't fit into these models of a kind of propertied internal gender and sexual identity, or a gender identity and a sexual identity that are separate from one another, right? So there's that transversalism, right, that Hocquenghem is talking about. So I think it's, so I feel like the term transgender is good at connecting these concerns to the present, right? But I think we also have to remember the specificities of the kinds of gender practices that were, and gender sexual practices that were going on at the time, and the contemporary identities that we have, like transgender and gay and so on, in many ways are exactly that kind of hardening that Hocquenghem is against, right?
Yeah, just to speak on my choice of the translation, because it was like a political choice, right? It's not, it wasn't like necessarily historically accurate,
right?
But so like I specifically did want to link it to today, but not to like trans identity kind of movements, but to like the potentials of radical trans movements, and that I think aren't fully exhausted, although they're maybe on the way towards that, especially with the new attacks and what I think people, the attacks against like transition and access to care for kids, I think the main kind of defense that will be motivated will be within the kind of rights situation that will, again, kind of close down transness into identity. But like the way he's talking about trans, he uses travesti in this, but he's not talking specifically about anyone at any moment. He's using it sort of like as an example of things. So like, I didn't want to say street queen or like transvestite, like, which was a historical term that people would use at that moment, because he's not speaking about specifically anyone. Although the FAR there was a group called the Gasoline who were, trans or transvestites or street queens who did kind of like sort of like situationist types of disruptions, and they're a really interesting group. And he might be thinking about them too. But so the way he uses transness, I think he later he doesn't use the word foe very much in this text, like a couple times, but I think in his later work, he's using the word foe, which is like queen, to think about the same stuff that he's talking about in this book about transness. And for me, that's like a kind of interesting sort of thing to bring to our current moment in thinking of transness and trying to articulate transness not as an identity politics, as it's like getting institutionalized in like queer theories and has journals and all that stuff, like to think of it as still maintaining some kind of threat to the social order, like, which is what Hocquenghem was like so excited about at that moment too.
Yeah.
So that was my idea there.
Yeah, I mean, I have very mixed feelings about that and about Hocquenghem's use of the travesti in general, because I think that it actually works very well with how the prefix trans gets picked up in academia as this kind of transversal, as this term that can mean 1,000 different things, right? And kind of detached from the historical and political and labor experiences of trans people, right? But I'm also, I also think that I mean, I kind of want to, I think it's interesting that Guy Hocquenghem, right, is a gay man during this period who's writing very favorably about the positions of travesti and foot, right, and what they might mean for liberation politics or a kind of anarchist politics, and this is in a context where we don't have that many historical writings, say within the FAR, by people who would be considered folle or travesti or something like that, right? So his words kind of become our historical memory of that position, right? And there's been so many cases in academia of gay men, mostly gay men, maybe some lesbians, taking the figure of the trans woman, right? Definitely lesbians as well, right? Taking the figure as the trans woman to mean certain things, right? Both negative and revolutionary, right? And so they become invested with a kind of theoretical and political purpose that I'm not sure matches what the purpose was to people living in those subject positions at that time, right? Certainly there are many trans people who are invested in having a kind of social stability to their genders and identities, for instance. And so I don't know, it seems a bit cheap to me, this the jump from travesti to transversal and the investment of transversality with this kind of infinite potential to undo identities and move between terms and transmute from one thing into another, right, from an outside perspective. So yeah, I think that basically trans people get thrown under the bus when they become symbols for politics.
Yeah, I guess like the things that I'm trying to connect it to are like current radical trans thinking, like in like the transgender Marxism book, and that there's a sort of strand in France now of transmaterialism, which has some sort of contiguities and some limitations, but like thinking about transition as this collective process, like rather than thinking about transgender or transsexual as like a specific singular identity or like something that like, so I'm sort of trying to connect it to that kind of discourse. Right. But I definitely agree with you. And like, he talks about his own need to kind of like he was like, I would get mad at the people who are like acting queenie, you know, and around other people, and like kick them under the table, and like, so he realizes his own sort of replication of that masculinist like sort of culture, and yeah, so I think, you know, he starts to try to undo that in some way.
Yeah. And you can also see within these texts that at the time there's a big debate within the gay liberation movement about the status of the queen and whether the queen is just an internalization of negative stereotypes about women, or of heterosexual ideas that say, well, if somebody wants to get fucked, then they're a woman and therefore inferior and therefore gossipy, petty, you know, mean, all of these things. And therefore you need to undo this patriarchal programming rather than keep on being full, you know. So there's a lot of debate around gender here. Also, as you can see within the passage that was read, around the presence of women, right? Because it becomes the FA, you know, the FA versus the MLF, right? Mm-hmm. But you know, the FA was founded by lesbians, and so when he talks about how that building became a cruising ground, right? It was a cruising ground for the gay men in the FAR, and the lesbians were not very happy about it. So, you know, so gender politics like continued to be a stumbling block, even within, you know, maybe especially within this kind of radical politics of the unleashing of desire. That was what Hocquenghem was really behind, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, but I wanted to say, like, because you brought up transgender Marxism, that I totally agree, you know, with that connection. And I think that what I worry about is the disconnection from materiality, right? Say from the labor conditions of trans women, or the way that you know, the way that sex work has been part and parcel of trans misogyny, for instance, right? When you take that out and trans becomes this floating term for a kind of, you know, revolution against the gender binary or something like that, then I think you lose a lot.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah,
Max, did you want to jump in?
That was a really interesting number of ideas you both went over. I wanted to just yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is useful, but I think there is something about yeah, I don't know, Kadji, I don't want to like make you, you know, leak your next book or whatever, but there is something about this kind of like backwards quality in these figures that, I don't know. Yeah, I find Hocquenghem is kind of interesting as, I don't know that he treats them in the exact way that I would like them to be treated or whatever, but he like delivers an interesting set of pieces for you to look at. And I'm sorry to any super fans of this book who were at the last thing, but I shared this anecdote in the last one. I'm going to do it again really quick. There's a really beautiful scene in the Hocquenghem book that I translated, where he kind of describes the passage from this one sexual order to the present one, or to the revolutionary one, where he's like, he is the younger boy who has like been brought to the this like winter retreat, Christmas retreat, whatever, by the foes, by the older queens. And there's like a fire and the place burns down, and there's this like beautiful kind of like you know, whatever the household that they've kind of like created of this like, you know, kind of perverse family or whatever with the queens and the boys. It burns down, and then the next scene is the kind of like entry into revolutionary politics. And so I think what's interesting for me about Hocquenghem is the way that he it is in his whatever the kind of like success or failure of his theorization, he's an interesting register of this moment of transition between sort of sexual orders or political sort of investments in these categories or whatever. And like, he still kind of has the traces of these kind of things that are now fully repressed except for when they come back, right? So like the pederast is somehow now exactly the threat to transness as a rights-bearing category, right? Because that's what's happening when children decide they want to be trans, is that they have some unbearable sexual agency or sort of internal quality that like can only be associated with like predation. And so like there's these weird temporal, like, I don't know, wormholes or something that like I think Hocquenghem provides a bit of orientation to, or something like that. I don't know exactly what my like claim for his like
I do love that way of approaching it. I mean, in one sense, you see all the figures that populated the pre-gay liberation gay world, right? Swarming in this text: the pederast, the pedophile, the folle, the travesti, the closeted gay man, you know, and all the gay men who are having sex with straight men, right? And you can see what a chaotic movement it was, trying to bring all of that together into a politics, much less a revolutionary politics, right? And trying to say what it was that they were all doing together, what the potential was within all of this, and where it adhered. And so you can see that this is all kind of live at this moment. Like nothing has quite been decided. You know, in this text, there's already the sense that something has been lost in terms of the hardening into an identity politics that's just around coming out, but not even all that would later be lost, right? So I'm interested in the 1970s is this, for me, pivotal decade, right? Where all of these figures that populate the sexual underworld, right, some of which I named, suddenly there's this massive oversimplification where, say, in the United States in the 1980s, when you go to a gay bar, it's clones, right? It's these super masculine men dressed up as construction workers, as sailors, right, as police officers. And those were all figures of the men that the faggots or the queens were having sex with, right? So they try to become the straight figures that they were having sex with in order to have sex with each other and have an autonomous gay culture, right? But in building this autonomous gay culture, so much is lost, right? So for one thing, gender diversity, the folle and the travesti are out, right? To the point where soon transsexual and transgender emerge as completely independent categories that are supposed to have nothing to do with homosexuality anymore, right? Whereas before they were seen as exemplifying homosexuality, right? If you were a gay man, that meant that on the inside you were exactly the same as that folle over there. You were just hiding it, right? So there's this massive like epistemological transformation in what homosexuality is, right? Which also creates this transformation in actual practices of gender and of sexuality, right? And all these figures that are left behind as like not a part of gay politics, but also as unsavory, outdated, self-hating, tied to street work, to racialization, to sex work, to sex in public. I mean, in this text, you get a sense that gay sex is sex in public, right? That's what it is. And so that's also another thing to remember now that gay sex is often seen as just what you do in private in your domestic interior, right? But it's that public version of gay sex across social class with people who might be unlikely, right? That Hocquenghem initially is investing with desire and potentiality.
Yeah, so like that figure of the kind of macho gay from the 80s is something he starts to, he like has different names for it, like the aftershave, gay, like fag, or like the US, he associates it with like American in particular, but he makes this diagnosis. So like, I want to maybe transition this into like, how do we think about Hocquenghem as a figure? Because like I'm not presenting him as like someone who we have to idealize or is always right, but I think he gets certain things like right, and he grasps for the right things, and he's struggling towards the right things in a lot of ways, and sometimes gets them very wrong. But I think he really diagnoses that the kind of deal with the devil that the gay movement makes to get some modicum of acceptance is going to create the figure of the pedophile, which is, we're still living under that threat, right? And the figure of the what becomes like transsexual, transgender, as like, and it's sort of like what Gail Rubin says in Thinking Sex, right? That there's like the charm circle, and that like there's always going to be people on the outside, but he says that the kind of the, you know, middle class, the bourgeois gay men make this deal that is going to throw those people under the bus basically forever. And I think we're still in that. Like, we see a little bit more acceptance of trans people now, but it's tenuous, right? Like, it's clearly tenuous, and that comes also not just at the right-wing reactionary, like Christian fundamentalist insurgents, but like with the TERF, the sort of so-called radical feminists who are anti-trans. So I think that's just really interesting that he made that call right at the beginning, that was going to be the sort of terms on which the deal was made.
Yeah, that's true. That's a fantastic analysis of his. And to go back to what I think both of you were saying about pederasty, especially what Max was saying, yeah, I think that the reason that queer people and trans people, and especially trans women, or like whoever tries to facilitate a child's transition, you know, maybe even their parents, can be demonized as pedophiles today, you know, against all reality, is because we've never really carried on the debate that was started in the 1970s, right? You know, so that debate was started maybe under terms that we would reject today, but nevertheless, what happened is that gay people essentially were at some point were like, no, you know, we're not pedophiles, we're not pederasts. That was never true, right? That was a homophobic invention, and we refused to engage that, right? And so what that does is it allows the pedophile to loom as this frightening, horrible figure. You know, everybody agrees, right? The pedophile is the worst thing imaginable, right? And because everybody agrees that that's the case, because nobody contests that or nuances that under any circumstance, we have the possibility of people saying, and you know, along with the pedophile comes the figure of the innocent child that must be protected, right? Mm-hmm. And so because we've also not really carried through those arguments about child sexuality and what it means to care about the autonomy, the self-determination, right, the incipient sexuality of children, then that just allows enemies on all sides to brand anybody as pedophile, right? And to see anything that encroaches upon children and their developing sexual and gender identities as child abuse, right? So to some extent, it's because the left has not, because we haven't created a leftist discourse around this, that we're so vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
I just to interject, because there was a question, but when I was talking about the deal that was made, I was saying that like some acceptance of like a gay rights movement that would give like, you know, rights within the liberal state to a certain kind of acceptable gay man came at the price of rejecting certain groups of people, which for Hocquenghem includes pederasts, pedophiles, and also trans people. And I would include like sex workers too there, as being outside of the possibility of getting that acceptance. So I just wanted to clarify. But in that, you know, picking up on what you were saying, Kadji, too, because like, so Hocquenghem had a relationship with his high school teacher, René Chévert, who's still alive. I got his email address and I want to email him. And so he was 15 and had a relationship with René Chévert, who like turned him on to homosexuality, turned him on to leftist politics also. So it was like a big moment in his life, and he never felt harmed by him, and worked with Chévert. They wrote together a book called Co-Ir about the system of childhood, is what they call it, right? So it's not a defense of pederasty. It's more, I think it's interesting. It kind of does a Foucauldian analysis of like the imposition of childhood as this like innocent thing, and thinking about it as a system of hierarchy, discipline, and control that has as part of the potentiality to unleash this idea of like a childhood sexuality. But Hocquenghem has like recently been kind of canceled in France for his association with pedophiles or pederasty because of the Matzneff affair. But I don't think that's sort of like he brings up, but I don't think he's making that same kind of defense that like someone like Matzneff or these other people who are explicitly writing like erotic fiction, Tony Duvert, I think, was another. He's doing a different thing, and he's also writing from the perspective as the younger man, like you were saying, Max, in his final book too. He's like still thinking it from that perspective, which I think is important to honor. And like when you're talking about what he says about it, because he was the child, right, in that situation.
Right. Yeah, and I think that obviously teenagers have sex and are sexual beings, right? And I think that there's something absurd about saying, oh yeah, it's completely non-harmful and like fun if they're having sex with each other, right? But all of a sudden it becomes very harmful if they're having sex with somebody who's over a certain age, and that line can shift, right? Because yeah, I think a lot of time, it's quite possible for somebody to have sex with a teenager that ends up being very harmful, right? And sometimes that kind of inexperience and clumsiness or newness to sex or toxic ideas about sex that some teenagers might have can feed into that. But more in terms of what you were saying, Scott, I think during this time period in the 1970s in France, part of the problem is a problem of vocabulary, right? Because the term pédéraste had been used for ages in France, and was often, by that time had become just a generic term for a gay man, right? But it also had the connotation of like, say, somebody who was attracted to teenage boys, that whole like teenage man model, right? And during the 1970s, that was actually being rejected because it was associated with conservative pederasts, right? That had written canonical gay literature at that point, right? And who idealized Greek and Rome and wanted to, and saw pederasty as completely coherent with patriarchy and with the social order and with hierarchical institutions, right? All male institutions. So there is that version of pederasty in Europe at the time that is not anti-institutional or anti-civilization, but that says pederasty is the core of Western civilization, right? And I think that's actually a really interesting reading of Western civilization with all of its hierarchies and its same-sex institutions that we could deploy critically now, actually. But so radical leftists at the time, like some of them are rejecting the term pederasty because of those connotations. And the term pedophile is a pretty new term, like nobody is using it at that time. Nobody's using it, certainly in the sense that we use it today, to refer to that evil person who preys on small children. And so they're like, oh, here's a fresh new term that doesn't have these conservative connotations. Let's bring that back. But what they're actually talking about is the model of like the teenager and the older man. So a lot of that does get lost in translation and without, and in the contemporary moment.
Yeah. And also just as you were talking about like the kind of consonance of a certain kind of pederasty with European civilization institutions, you talk about this in your book too, and Hocquenghem refers to it, like it was also a colonial, as an aspect of French colonialism in particular. There was a whole scene of like French gay men going to North Africa to sleep with young boys, Arab boys. Gide writes about it a lot in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and it's been going on for a while. And that's still sort of part of what they're talking about at this time in the 70s as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And right, and that gets us on the topic of colonialism, but I actually wanted to pause it and see if we wanted to see if there were questions from the audience. Is this, I just wanted to do a time check, basically. Should we just keep going, or should we?
Yeah.
I guess we're rounding on the end of our time. So if anyone has questions, someone's just posted one. Okay. Rachel writes, thanks all. This is also smart and important and timely. A couple things. One, I'm thinking of how people like Spivak and Butler assert the need for strategic essentialism and how our movements do that so quickly because it's kind of the only way it's been done in an organized way. But how it's been so easy to talk about abortion as a thing that impacts all people, not just the category of women, while still acknowledging the legacy of patriarchy and misogyny. I guess the question is, do you agree we can abandon those categories and still have political/power gains? Are those gains even desirable for Hocquenghem? And then 2, what would he think of the movement for asexuality, which seems very rooted in identity and also a spectrum placement as just as deviant as those Gail Rubin identifications outside the charm circle? So there's a couple questions there.
Yeah, those are excellent. Go ahead.
I mean, my first thought on the second question about like asexuality, like, you know, while Hocquenghem is this like proponent of this kind of, you know, amorphous mobile desire that like disrupts everything, I think he like verges, especially as he gets disillusioned with the gay movement, on a kind of sex negativity, right? Like I think he starts to disinvest it with that, you know, that the sort of reflexive liberatory power that he thinks it has, because I think he starts to see that it's like, you know, he talks about how it's connected to institutions like sports and military, for example, like same-sex eroticism at least. And I think like what we could learn from him is like focusing more on, like, one of the things that he brings up a lot in this book is the end of the family, which I think is like for him the sort of laboratory of all of these things. So okay, so that didn't really answer your question about ace as an identity, but like I don't think that Hocquenghem would necessarily be like anti-asexuality. I think we could even get to a sex pessimism from Hockenghem's critiques of sexual liberation from within the movement.
Yeah, and in terms of strategic essentialism, I don't know, like a part of me wants to push back against this kind of endless transversalism that Hocquenghem is trying to uphold in his critique of all identity. And so, yeah, I'm more in the camp of strategic essentialism, of intersectionality, and of coalitions that acknowledge difference, right? And rather than, you know, I think it can be kind of dangerous to try to imagine the end of all identity. I mean, I think it's interesting that there are so many radical thinkers in the past, both in terms of the gay liberation thinkers and feminist thinkers, envisioned the end of identity as the end of politics, right? Especially the end of gender and sexual identities. And I don't know if we're in a more pessimistic period now or a more realistic period now. I mean, certainly there is a resurgence of that kind of discourse among gender abolitionists, for instance. And that's something that's very new. I think like a decade ago, most queer and trans people were like, yes, you know, our utopia involves many genders, not the abolition of gender. And people would laugh at these older feminist and gay visions. So in some ways, I think that question has come back, right? Which is really in tension, or that utopian ideal, right, has come back, which is in tension with a lot of contemporary political practices, which are like, okay, name your identity, claim your privilege, right, and then work as an ally to other people who may be more oppressed than you, right? Which has it, I don't know, you know, has its pros and cons. I think that Hocquenghem would be very against the kind of rules that are created by that kind of model about who can speak for whom, what is the proper role of so-and-so within the movement, right? And implicitly who is more radical than whom. But I think that also the history of racism within queer politics, especially inside of the US, has brought about this kind of transformation in political practices. So I don't know if that answers the question, or if others want to chime in here.
Max, give some thoughts.
I do have some thoughts, but wait, Kadji, can you? I mean, that last thing you said, that's really interesting. I'm just not sure which way you mean it. Like the transformation has been towards a type of strategic essentialism or away from it?
Yeah, towards a type of strategic essentialism, I think. Yeah.
Because that's necessary for overcoming the sort of like the racist.
Right. Or maybe just a kind of essentialism. I don't know if it's a strategic essentialism actually.
Sure, right.
Yeah, I think a strategic essentialism might be better in some ways. But yeah, I think that one of the real tensions that I locate when we go back to our political debates, when going back to Hocquenghem's work is, how can we, I think some of his critiques of identity politics are so great and really foresightful and important and worth bringing back today, right? But the question that returns is, okay, well then, how do you have a kind of coalitional political movement that doesn't ride roughshod over people because it's not willing to see differences as important, right?
Totally. And I think you can see that in, I think you can see that in some of the passages in the shameless transversalism thing where he's well, let's see, am I thinking of this right?
He talks about differences in particular, like in a way that you're similar to how I feel like you're saying it, Kadji.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of like the passports to speak or whatever, right?
Right. And I was also thinking about his use of the term appropriate, right, which etymologically has to do with property, right? So, so for whom is the property in a certain position of speech, and for whom is that not their property, right? It all has to do with the construction of privatized individuals for who have certain properties attached to their identity, which is what he's against, right? And so yeah, like I see that. And then I think maybe the part you were referring to, Scott, is when he says, acknowledge where you're speaking from, but also allow the space for movement, that one doesn't have to remain there, right? And I like the neologism, allow people to become a fag dyke or a dyke fag. I can't remember how he puts it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He also, he says transversalism for him is, it's interesting how he puts it, like, he's like, there's the bourgeois idea of money as the universal exchange, but transversalism is a thing that like puts things together without making them the same, is how I understand it. And so like in my attempt to present this in the introduction, I'm like, okay, I think he's trying to get at something similar to the Combahee River Collective, but he uses like the opposite language in a way. Because I think he is imagining a coalitional politics, but he's like French, right? And he's got that like the French language, philosophical language of a kind of that like tends towards this like universalism or desubjectification, where they focus on identity as a way of making connections. And so I would like even put this up to like Kathy Cohen, finding the strange relationships between punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, right? Like that would be, I think like he would be up for that, right? Like, and saying that those positions that seem like that aren't organized around sexuality and gender in particular, or a deviance from the norm in some way, could create kind of unforeseen connections. I just don't think I think he has blind spots and doesn't have the language for it. And he's in his own sort of space. So, but for me, I think there's like a way to articulate it in those lines of like what we learned from like Black feminism, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a really enabling reading. I feel like in terms of the practices that he has in mind during this time period, like practices of transversalism though, he cites transition as one of those practices, right? But then also in terms of of his work more generally and the FARS politics more generally, I think that the main practice of transversalism was sex, right? Sex with people in the working class, right? Sex with straight people, sex with North Africans, and that's where I feel sex between old people and young people, or teenagers and adults, right? And that's where I feel like the model of transversalism as intersectionality really diverges, right? That's something very different that that I think does reflect, you know, a different political moment where there was such utopianism attached to sexual practice, right? And I think we're very distant from that today overall, to the point that some people have become really suspicious of sex as something that inevitably carries with it oppression, lack of consent, etc. Right? So there's, you know, in some ways, I feel like queer and trans culture has fallen into a kind of extreme policing of sex. So there's just like a huge historical gulf there that I don't quite know how to traverse, but I do think it brings up different questions about the politics of sex.
It's funny also, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was reminded when you read it at the beginning, Scott. It's funny that he also does have a bit of that critique, but it's directed at like the bourgeois gays, I suppose, who are like the necrophiliacs in New York, or like the sauna adepts or whatever. He's like, there's this kind of somehow, you know, let's say politically sterile investment in pleasure as such that like has no hope of escaping monetary exchange. But then at the end, he's like, our way out is pleasures, intensification of these, you know, motorcycles and untimeliness and stuff. And it's like, I don't know. Yeah, I sympathize with that kind of like bind, I guess, because I sometimes struggle to imagine like what the right vehicle is or whatever. But it's funny that it's hard for me to imagine what he thinks is the sort of distinction. And I don't know. I wonder if that isn't connected to this kind of like return of this kind of imaginary of sex as a kind of harm that you're talking about, because you know, like we were talking about how like, you know, there's this kind of like restrictive concept of that's present in these like anti-sex works or trans tropes or whatever, but it does come from queer people as well, you know, like this is the kind of like now yearly Kink at Pride conversation, right? And that is, you know, I don't exactly know how to sort of sift through the like different posts and stuff and get to the reality of who's behind it, but it seems like it's coming from younger people who have a concept of sex in public, of like kink, and like transness somehow as this like this threat, right, to their innocence, which they see queer politics as protecting, or their identity as protecting, or something like that.
Exactly. And there's also some anti-drag queen politics sometimes, the accusation that drag queens are transmisogynist and transphobic,
right.
Which, you know, historically drag queens and those who we might be able to identify as trans women are actually inseparable, you know, in the figure of the transvestite or the folle. And so yeah, I mean, part of this backwards trans theory is about, you know, recovering some of those connections and some of those subject positions that have been pushed out of the orbit of, you know, what the definition of trans today, and also the definition of trans politics.
I think another useful thing for me here in thinking through this is Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is about public sex, but he specifically, I mean, he just talks about how, you know, in the 90s, so it's like onward 20 years of like more of neoliberalization, right? Where like the class struggle takes away all of the places where there can be contact between people. That's the word he uses, across these differences. And so where we're at now, you know, 50, 60 years later, like people are so preserved from the danger of like difference in so many ways that I think like it's very hard for us to think about like what they saw, because they were in spaces that were more like dangerous in that way of exposing yourself to difference. And I don't think those things exist for us in the same way today. And like, you know, so Delaney's book is really at this transitional moment in the 90s of where like, because of like, you know, health scare around HIV used as a reason to like up development, all these public spaces are kind of going away. And COVID was another like battlefront in that, especially in where all the states are kind of like, you know, sweeping and evicting houseless people. So I think, I don't know, that would be the place where I would go to think about like why it's where it is now, and like what they were seeing that we don't really see today.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I would just add on to that the way that gay sex apps have, you know, furthered this privatization, right? That you don't have to go to a park to cruise, or to like an open space where you might encounter any number of different types of people by chance. Instead, you can you have this whole menu of options, and you can choose which one to bring into your private domestic space, right? So there's that idea of choice and consent and domesticity, you know, all these liberal values that I think Hocquenghem calls out at this early moment.
Totally, but talk about a bell, a heavy collar that you're wearing with the bell that alerts the entire order of your every movement. I mean, this is exactly what he's saying is there in the very beginning of affirming a political identity, right? It's like it's like all you need is an identity, and then, you know, 50 years later there's data trackers and they're fucking, you know, telling Peter Thiel literally every step you take to talk to other gay people, and they're selling that to various ad brokers and things like that.
And so yeah, and then we're just generating revenue for them in like this, like the kind of spectacleized version of what they were doing in the 70s. It's like just become an investment for the corporations.
Right.
Well, I see. Okay, so we're at 8:30. Should we just arbitrarily end it there? Does anyone want to say any kind of last things?
I feel like you said so much great stuff in your introduction, Scott. Do you want to channel some of that?
Well, I love talking to both of you. So I just want to thank you for talking. Like Kadji, your book is really, you know, I cited in the introduction, is helpful for me for thinking about Hocquenghem and like the kind of place that he holds within this history of liberation, that like, and the desires that I think we have now to like inherit some of that militancy and revolutionary fervor, or evolutionary fervor, I guess, for Hocquenghem today, but like without falling into the same sort of traps. So like, I don't know, this is obviously an ongoing discussion. And Max, yeah, I always appreciate like your thoughtfulness and way of approaching all these questions, and your willingness to keep talking to me in multiple instances too, as a fellow Hocquenghem translator. So for me, this was very productive and a generative discussion, and I hope that it was for the people who attended too. And if you read the book and have things to say, I'd love to hear from you, because I'm just wanted to translate this to get into discussion for our movements, because I think it speaks to us, and not always in what we should do, but like he was dealing with all the same sort of issues. So feel free to reach out to me if you read this and want to talk to me about it, or if you want to talk to me about it for any other reason. And so yeah, thank you, and thank you to Firestorm for hosting us. Firestorm is like, you know, my home bookstore, and I love all the people there.
Yeah, and thanks for this invitation, Scott and Firestorm. And yeah, it's great to be in conversation with both of you. I love your introduction, Scott, and I very much admire the work you've done, Max, with Christopher Chitty's book. So it was great talking to both of you.
Yeah, it was a delight to have this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks everyone. For folks who are still here, yeah, thank you. Just an incredibly nuanced conversation. Anybody who registered will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording so you can watch it again, and I hope folks will. I dropped a link there in the chat to the book, so if you haven't picked it up yet, it's a great way to support the writer and the translator. And so thanks for taking the time, everyone, tonight. This was really great. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good night. Bye now.